I was sitting here listening to the Cosmic Nomad podcast by Bailey. Don't remember her last name now. But I just discovered today that she has a podcast, and I really enjoy her Instagram videos. She's one of the very few people that I do actually watch their content on Instagram, because if I go on Instagram, I typically go on to upload something, and usually she's got a video is the first thing that I see, and I typically watch and engage with her content because I very much feel a harmonic resonance with her frequency. And what she was discussing in the podcast that I was listening to currently was some of her experience with traveling. And I found myself, as I was sitting here listening, I was using this tobacco pouch that I made years ago, and I was rolling cigarettes. And then, for me, the only time I've lived in Adelaide, South Australia my whole life, and I've only left Australia once to go on a cruise to Vanuatu 2015, 2005, I don't know, sometime back then. I went on a cruise there, and that was the only time I've really left Australia. And Australia has really, Adelaide has really changed, but Australia as well. Someone reminded me recently, apparently I'm 41 years old now. I keep saying 40, I'll probably be 40 for the next 60 years. Because I'll just be like, oh yeah. People will tell me the other numbers, and I'm like, yeah, whatever, it's just a number. Because that's something that I don't buy into, is age, because age is a program. Like, the present moment is all that exists. But back to travel, even though I haven't really left the country, besides that one short journey for, I don't know, 12 days, 14 days, something like that. Strangely enough, I was in a intentional discomfort seeking mode for quite some time, which at one point led me to doing a lot of food deliveries a few years ago, and then buying a motorbike and learning how to ride while doing food deliveries, which was, I used to be terrified of motorbikes. That's why I bought one, because just the expansion from actively seeking the most discomfort possible, which then that journey, that was, I did the food deliveries for nearly a year, which then, through that experience, I'd interacted with a lot of different businesses, a lot of different people at different businesses, and just seeing the different ways people were doing different things, the different ways businesses were doing things for tax reasons, the intention behind different things were different. And then, I spoke to many different drivers while waiting for food to be ready. And, there was a curiosity about rideshare driving, like driving Uber and Didi with passengers. And there was a part of me inside that I found was terrified, because just so, everything about it is unknown. Like the interaction, conversation, when you haven't done something before, there's always that level of unknown, which then, the curiosity for that experience led me to buying a brand new car, specifically so that, initially working enough to save up the deposit to buy a brand new car. So then I bought a brand new Camry Hybrid and started doing rideshare. literally zero. I just remembered as well. Literally zeroing my bank account to get that Camry Hybrid to start that experience. And I knew straight away that it was going to be really life changing, but I really didn't know just how life changing, because there's no, it's not like social media or anything else that's kind of online where you've got all of these filters and screenings. Like, even though it's using the internet, like through the apps, it's all physical experiences, because once you hit accept ride and then rock up, there's a human being getting in your car. Well, not just human beings, because animals also. And some of the experiences that I had over it was around 2 years that I did rideshare driving, and would have had at least 10,000 people in my car. So any experiences that I do share is just like tip of the iceberg, like because there was also, cats and dogs and kittens and puppies, and I was disappointed that nobody got in the car with a snake or anything. Like, I was really hoping for that. Or, I was super keen. At some point I realised, I'm like, anything's possible. Someone could give birth on the back seat, like, and so I was so open for any experience that it was like, even if that's someone giving birth on the back seat, like, I wanted it as unique as possible, and I ended up getting it because, that's that's how life works. It's where our focus goes, our attention goes, and then that grows, and then that physically manifests. It's how reality is constructed. Which I would actively play with also. Like, there was times where I just remembered I picked up one girl from ISKCON Temple at Kilburn and dropped her home or wherever she was going. And, that was at a time where I was contemplating attending ISKCON, because that was, prior to me actually visiting that place. And then having someone that I could, literally just have a quick conversation with about the place, and, suggested times to visit and stuff like that. But then, actively went in, had the experience of ISKCON Temple, and then the Ganesh temple at Marion. And then there was one particular day that I really wanted to visit the temple, but I was aware that it was a really busy day for driving, and also it was some auspicious date, and so I knew that it was going to be really busy that day. So I was like, it didn't feel like it would flow in a line for me to just naturally go and visit. But then I ended up having to pick up a passenger from there, and just being at the front door was enough that day, that it was like I felt like I needed to visit the temple on that day, but I didn't really feel like I needed to go into the temple. And so having that experience, with then sharing that experience with a passenger also, because, a lot of the times when you're in a temple, you're kind of flying solo, but having an experience outside of a temple with someone else who also visits that same temple, you start the conversation and interaction on a completely different frequency versus, you pick up someone from an office. Like, the interaction conversation I'd have with someone like those two particular women that I just mentioned, versus you pick up someone from Hungry Jack's that's just finished work, or someone in the city that's just finished their office job. The conversation and interaction is typically a lot different, based on where people are typically comfortable with having conversations about whatever their default range of subjects is. Because some people are more cautious of conversations, which then there was also the fact that people would get in the car and they'd use it almost as a confessional on wheels, because some of the things that people would share, it was like, and people would often share like that was the first time they'd ever mentioned that thing to anybody. I mean, I've had that experience my whole life, but then experiencing it while driving people, it was like just meeting someone and them telling you something about their life that was like, any extreme on the polarity scale for whatever you can come up with in your mind, like that kind of range and beyond. But then also, different cultures and languages, and it was almost like, because there was a part of me that really has wanted to travel the world, like not in particular any one place, but the entire world. And in some ways, it was almost like the world came to me because I met people from places that I didn't even know existed, like interacting with people from India, for example. Throughout life, growing up here, there was very, very few people from anywhere else besides Australia. Well, besides, there was Italians, Greeks, that, and then, descendants from England. Like that was kind of the variety. And then, maybe someone, like I remember I reckon there was one or two different people like from other countries in primary school. Like people who have lived in Adelaide for the last 40 years, they know what I'm talking about. Like the change in the diversity from, worldwide travel from everywhere. I mean, it's not just here, it'd be happening simultaneously everywhere around the world. And then having, people from everywhere, and then sharing about, their culture and their traditions and the places, like, it's like I have this smorgasbord of information about so many different places now. It's like including in Adelaide with restaurants and all sorts of different things in Adelaide. Like if you're listening to this and you ever know someone who's done like food deliveries or rideshare driving, and you want to know where the good places to eat are or the places to avoid, like they're the people to talk to, because people are usually very happy to talk about their experience, good or bad, because I mean, you pick up a couple or friends from a restaurant and they're talking about the experience they just had in there, so you don't even have to ask half the time. But that was something that I really enjoyed doing, was exploring different cuisines, because I'd met so many people. Like one of my passengers I'd picked her up a couple of times, because if you work in different areas, you sometimes pick up some people. Like the first ever guy that I picked up, my first ever ride, I drove him probably, I don't know, maybe 8 or 10 times, because he lives local and I would typically be in this area more. And anyway, this woman offered me some food who was from another culture, and traditional home cooked food from another culture that you've never been exposed to before. And it was like, wow, this is so, similar ingredients, but this experience of eating it was so different that then I started actively seeking things like that as well. Like going back to India, Nepal, places like that, there's a lot of passengers from those countries that catch rideshare rides. So, overall, I would probably say that 40% of my passengers, somewhere in that ballpark, would have been from those two countries, or surrounding as well, like Sri Lanka and Pakistan and places like that. Like if you just that part of Southeast Asia, like probably 40%. I mean, which is due to the type of work they're doing and transport and different things. Like lots of it was also interesting seeing like different things from different cultures, where different cultures prioritize different things over other things. So it's like the exposure to the world and travel that I experienced. I'm so grateful for those experiences, for the interactions that I had. That like as you go about your day-to-day life, there's only a certain amount of people that you interact with, whereas doing something like that, the level of variety just increases exponentially. Like prior to that, I don't even know if I'd met 10,000 people. I have no idea, but just travel can be so many different things. And even driving around Adelaide, the way that Adelaide has changed over the course of my life, it's always different. And especially now, like the level of construction is, I'm really grateful that I'm no longer driving rideshare, because the amount of roadworks that, it's nice to have a change of scenery from that kind of scenery now, because we can be in the same kind of areas but just doing different things and focusing on different things, and then it's like a completely different experience. Like me going from mostly doing rideshare to now mostly doing firewood, and actively working with the physical body in a different way, because the way I was working with the body doing rideshare was, if I go back to my past, I spent the vast majority of my human experience, years, experiencing dis-ease and disharmony and, all of those type of things. Having very, very little capacity, if any at all, a lot of the time, to then finding myself having health and well-being and no longer having those experiences that I previously did, that it was like, well, now that I can work with this body and I know how to sort of be in the driver's seat of the body and work with it rather than just forcing it to do what I wanted it to do, and or vice versa, not even knowing how to work with the body, to then, driving long days, I would just say, because I'm aware, that apparently I shouldn't say some numbers. But you can drive really long days doing rideshare, and especially when you do big weeks, like consecutive big weeks. And that was a point that I had never managed to go to with the physical body in that way before. Which then, led me to now have the capacity to go and move tons of, like, cut and split and move tons of firewood, where, previously, like, go back to when I was around 20, I fractured my back for the first time. And, back then perceiving that I was going to have to baby my back my entire life, and that, I'll never be able to pick up super heavy stuff, and not even believing there was a possibility that I could have an experience other than that, to now experiencing life where there's a part of me that would like to get the bathroom scales and weigh myself, and then weigh, like probably an 80 kilo piece of wood out the front of me just picking it up, and my back being like, it's the rest of the body that can't keep up now. It's like the grip strength and physical strength that I have in, you know, my core and my arms to lift heavier weights, which it's, you know, even the way that I'm so connected and tuned into my body now as I'm doing this physical activity more and more strenuous, to the point that, to be honest, you know, if I was in a gym, I would have tapped out and left like way before I would reach with doing something like firewood. That it's easier to stay motivated for me because, you know, I reckon I've been in a gym once in my life. It's just, yeah, those places are not for me. Whereas, you know, moving tons of wood, like I can break through all of those barriers of perception that I have to just keep going. And then it's like you break through one of those barriers where you're like, I'm about to pass out, but you keep going, and then you're just like in this new frame of parameters of working with the physical body, you know, and not even just the physical body, the body, the mind, emotions, all of it. It's all simultaneously. And then consciously breaking through those, you know, moments where you hit the wall, where you're like, I can't go anymore, and you keep going, and you're just like, wow, what even was that blockage? And then recently noticing, like, just because of the way that I work with the body, that I actively speak health and well-being into my body and over my body and my being and my experience and my life, because I learned that is how you experience health and well-being, is by consciously choosing the thoughts, the words, the emotions, all of it. It's choose our own adventure in life to the experience that we want to experience. You know, back then I used to speak from a state of victim consciousness for the vast majority of my life, and then it wasn't until I chose to become a conscious creator of my own reality that, you know, in subtle ways initially, but then at some point looking back and realizing, like, oh wow, I've been consciously creating my reality for quite some time. Consciously, intentionally, rather than unconsciously, unintentionally. Because in victim consciousness land, it was the other, whereas now it's the opposite. But then also, like, flowing with life rather than trying to force and control it. You know, it's nice weather out today, and, you know, I know there is a possibility that if I wanted to, I could be out cutting wood today, but there's also this other aspect of my being, which is me sitting in this frequency and me expressing whatever naturally feels aligned for me to just express, which, you know, for me it's an essential part of me working on maintaining my vibration and, you know, being consciously aware of where my prana is, because the body, for me, the physical body is I'm going to use an abstract way of describing it. If I was to imagine the physical body as a hologram, a projected hologram, which is essentially what it is, as a projection of consciousness physically manifested from, you know, pure source energy. It keeps it gives me that opportunity to connect in a different way to the vibration of sound as it's being created. You know, it's also a feedback loop, because reality, the way that reality projects and then reflects and then, you know, goes out and back in, the way that I perceive sight and sound, there's also this resonance in the physical body for me that I am aware as I'm speaking. Like, that's what I've kind of been tuned more into, is the physical body. It's like I'm looking with my sight, but the sight is like 10%, whereas 90% of my awareness is in the physical body. What am I feeling in the physical body? which is why I intentionally lit this again, because I wanted to have something that would create a different experience for me to shift my awareness on the shift within my physical body of me having this experience. To essentially ask myself, is my vibration at the point where I want to be experiencing life? Because I know what my vibration is at directly correlates to the experience that I will experience in my physical human experience and reality. You know, it's like, you know, I was mentioning about driving rideshare, and there was some equally polarizing experiences on, you know, the the duality swing of the pendulum from, you know, those incredible experiences such as the temple, or, you know, one girl that I just remembered came from Bhutan, and the moment I saw her, like, because when you're driving rideshare, you just get to a point where you can just tell who the passenger is before they see the number plate and realize that you're there to pick them up. It's like you often see them because they just, yeah. People have lots of common things no matter where people are from. But anyway, yeah, some passengers, like, you would just see them straight away, and it's like, for me, I was always actively working on maintaining my energy being wide open so that I was then capable of being as receptive as possible to whatever life presented for me to, you know, experience and perceive. And, you know, like this... You alright? Like this girl from Bhutan, and then, you know, the conversation that we had was so different because her energy was also so wide open that, I mean, I can't recall the specifics of the conversation currently, but I remember it was a very open and, you know, genuinely sensitive, you know, type of experience where it was like both of us were emotionally open and expressive and sharing that experience consciously, both people at the same time. That then it was just like, sometimes then the next passenger could be the complete polar opposite contrast experience, where, yeah, they're not experiences that I feel like sharing, because I'd rather not manifest more experiences like that in my life, because those experiences taught me that. And so, you know, it's essentially what I was explaining, what I was doing before was, you know, looking at different aspects of my being. That's, yeah. Same as, you know, I was never really interested in comparing, you know, what I was earning to what other people were earning, because very quickly from driving, but also catching the occasional ride as well, like when the car was getting serviced or whatever, I'd just catch a ride. And in both situations, I was always so acutely aware that every interaction was so connected for whatever reasons, that even, you know, the different relationships people have with money is different. Like, you can't compare two drivers, you know, even if two drivers are driving in the same area and, you know, try and create as much similarity as possible, that each individual being has a different energetic vibrational frequency that they're emitting in any given moment, that it's incomparable, the earnings. So that wasn't something that I ever really bothered about, but I was aware that there were times where there was nothing happening, like no trips would come through. I was acutely aware that it was me and my vibration as to that was why I was experiencing the experience I was experiencing. It wasn't that there wasn't passengers or there was too many drivers or whatever story, because you can go into storyland so easily. But it was always like I might have got to a point where I was ignoring my body, where it was like my bladder needed emptying, or something that it was like I needed that moment to shift my focus or process or integrate an experience that I'd had, for me to realize why I had the experience, so then I didn't need to rinse and repeat, because something like that where it's fast paced, high turnover, if I wasn't paying attention, then I might end up rinsing and repeating the same drive 10 times in a day, like different face, different place, but it'll be the same experience over and over again. And change is, if there's no change, there's a stagnancy, which means there's a, for me, I identified that as being some kind of blockage or stagnancy within my energy field that passengers would always bring my awareness to, because everything is so connected that it's just mirroring me back to me. So that if there was times where I was having an unpleasant experience, it was because I was experiencing something that I was perceiving as unpleasant within myself, that as soon as I would shift it, then the rides would change. And I really worked with, at some point in the past, I chose to experience life as life is my yoga. When I understood what yoga was, that it's a continuous practice and learning and deepening, that it's not just, that it wasn't just, stretches and poses. And, that's not something that I've pursued, is those things, because I work with the body in the way that I work with the body. I don't need to go through those asanas to reach those states of being, to then reach that level of connectedness. I can just directly connect to different parts of my being or body or whatever. That for me, I realized that the entirety of my reality is to provide a feedback loop. And for me, the way that the external does that for my internal, it's the same for the opposite. For you, whatever you is. And it really, the more recent times in my human experience has really been me actively playing with life, all of life. Through people, through things, through places, through everything, like sitting here looking at the chainsaw, chain grinder, and a couple of chains that I ground last night, and like I ended up selling the Camry and had I probably had like 2.5 litres of hybrid engine oil sitting there brand new, that I was like, wonder what I'm going to do this with this. And then realizing that I'll use that to soak my chains after I've ground them, because before I grind my chains, I wash them in metho to clean them up, and then grind them, and then they're covered in oil again. And rebuilding chainsaws, and just seeing where life takes me through different experiences and interacting with different people. And all of life is everywhere all the time. It's just a matter of allowing it in or not, was what rideshare really, one of the big things rideshare taught me was, like if I ever got to the point where I was like, another Aussie, because, for me, I've spent my whole life around people, born and raised here, that it was like, give me the variety. But if I was fixated on the lack of it, then I wouldn't experience the abundance of the contrast. You know, the more I wanted the experience of more people from other cultures or whatever, you know, the hungrier I was for that, and the further away that was, because I was pushing it away rather than just being like, whatever, it'll turn up when it turns up, and then bang, next passenger gets in, and they're, you know, like there was some passengers that I experienced that a few times actually, passengers from China coming here for the first time. And I remember driving down Anzac Highway. I'm pretty sure I picked them up from the airport, and then we ended up going down Anzac Highway towards town. And their English was so limited that they only knew, I reckon it was, I don't know if they were sisters or just friends, but yeah, they were using some kind of translation app on their phone so that, you know, I could speak in English and they could speak in Mandarin, and, you know, if we needed to figure out like how to say different words, like, you know, even though it was, you know, through using a translation app, like the level of sincerity and genuineness in the interaction, where even though there wasn't an easy way to interact, it was finding that way, and just, you know, it being the experience that it was like, you know, quite general, easy conversations to have, not some really intricate, deep, you know, conversation, but it had the same depth, even though it was, you know, but that was also because of the level of effort everyone had to put in to interact, because it wasn't just easy the way that, you know, English for me just flows effortless. The way that I would really like to plug into other languages more consciously, and also allow those languages, like, you know, I can feel and embody different languages, but it's being plugged into the frequency of those languages and then getting the language to come out of my voice is something that I do find challenging, because I do have the awareness of the difference in the vibration of how it's being expressed to how I know it can be expressed, which it's, you know, if I articulate that in a physical way for people, you know, the way that, say you're sharpening a chainsaw chain, you know, if you've never filed or ground a chainsaw chain, you don't really know how to do it until you start doing it. And then when you first start, you're like, wow, that really sucks, because now I'm cutting banana shapes in logs or whatever, you know. Because, yeah, if you don't cut a chainsaw chain, if it's not ground or filed a certain way, like, you, instead of cutting up and down, like, you're cutting curves. Like, if you change the angle of one teeth, like, because typically when you hand file, you often hand file from one side to the other, and then you would do the opposite. And typically you might be more accurate or whatever on one side, or one side you might end up like just turning it at the end a little bit, and you end up rounding the tooth a bit, so then the chain's always like going one way. And, you know, I'm very familiar and comfortable with all that stuff now because I've done it, same as, you know, dot paintings or, you know, whatever. But it's, you know, interesting sharing stuff and seeing what comes up from within, like me just having that awareness of my own awareness of where I'm at with embodying other languages, which, you know, is because different languages are a very different bandwidth of energetic vibrations and frequencies, which is one of the reasons why I love other languages, because there's so much more to explore. But anyway, I've got stuff to do, so yeah. I felt like it was interesting because I stopped sharing some of this stuff for a while, like, you know, this kind of frequency of stuff, because it was triggering and all sorts of stuff for a lot of people. And, you know, people get uncomfortable and they don't like discomfort because they try and hide in this mask of comfortable familiarity and blah de blah. So I kind of reduced it, but now I'm just like, you know, I really do enjoy this form of expression, so I will continue currently. So I hope it's been useful.